Welcome to the CPA Ontario Practical Experience Overview Q&A session. My name is Simi Bogle and I'm a coordinator with the Employer Relations team. This webinar is developed for all CPA students who are completing their practical experience requirements. Upon registration of this webinar, we invited you to send us your questions in advance. We received many great questions and will aim to answer as many as possible within the time frame provided. Please note all participants of this webinar are muted. If you have additional questions, you are able to ask them via the question mark icon, and our team of experts will either answer your questions directly or repeat it openly at the end of the webinar to the audience for our presenters to answer. We encourage you to wait for the section you have a question about, as it is very likely your question will be answered throughout the presentation. There are 5 handouts for your reference: the guide to completing EVR experience reports, the quick reference guide for PERT tasks, the PERT user guides for EVR and PPR, and a copy of this presentation. I will hand over this to Janelle now.
Okay, sorry about that, you guys. We're having some technical difficulties, but if we go to the overview tab, so we're going to be focusing on the practical experience requirements today. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what it takes to meet the exit requirements, so the completion requirements. We're going to go through some of the different proficiency levels, and one of the questions that we got asked most often was what constitute or defines a level 2 response. And then we're going to be going over some of the areas of the competency framework, and we'll be discussing some of the common issues that we note, or that the reviewers note in terms of responses. And then we'll also be going through some of your questions for each of those areas. So for the questions, I'm actually going to get Fandu, who is our director, and she's going to be helping me answer some of those questions once we get there. So awesome. So the first section that we're going to cover is the technical competencies. So looking at this slide, all CPA students, regardless of what route you're in, whether or not that's experience verification or the pre-approved program, you guys all have the same exit requirements. So there's 6 distinct technical competency areas, and each of those have different sub-competency areas. So overall, there's 20 sub-competencies. So you have financial reporting and management accounting. Those are your core accounting requirements. You have audit and assurance. You have finance, taxation, and then strategy and governance. There's also the enabling competency requirements, which we're not going to focus on as much today, but you also have to meet those to a level 2 proficiency by the end of the term. And what we're going to be going over in the next couple of slides is what constitutes core, depth, breadth, and progression. So when we look at our core technical competency requirements, we're looking at the sub-competencies in financial reporting and management accounting. So this here is your core accounting knowledge. And what that means, in order to get your core competency requirements, it means that you must gain proficiency in any 3 competency sub-areas in financial reporting or management accounting to at least a level 1 proficiency. So it's not mutually exclusive. So you can have, for example, 2 sub-competencies in financial reporting and 1 in management accounting, or you can have all 3 in one particular area. Now, when we look at your depth, so your depth is achieving all sub-competencies within one distinct technical area with at least 2 of them at a level 2. So this is your specialization. So for example, you could have a depth in finance, you could have a depth in tax, you could have a depth in any of those areas, but you have to note that you have to gain proficiency in all of the technical sub-competency areas with 2 of them at a level 2. The important thing to note is that this is also not mutually exclusive with your core. So you could, for example, have your core in financial reporting and your depth in financial reporting as well. The proficiencies that you gain in the different areas can also help to count towards the requirements for your core or your depth. Okay, and so when we look at your breadth requirements, so this is your proficiency in at least 8 sub-competency areas with at least 4 of them at a level 2. All the others can be at a level 1. So again, kind of reiterating from before, they're not mutually exclusive. So the sub-competencies that you have in your core and your depth can also count towards your breadth requirements. All right, so when we talk about progression, so when we say progression, we're talking about the evolution of your competency development over the duration of your practical experience. So when us as reviewers, when we're looking at the requirements, we're assessing what stage you're at in your proficiency, and we're going to consider three things. So we're going to consider how routine the task is, how complex it is, and how autonomously you're working on that task. So when we look at some of the earlier stages of your proficiency development, at a level 0, level 1, that's more so confined to retrieving and comprehending information. It's a lot more administrative, a lot more clerical. You're probably not working as autonomously. When we look at the middle stage, where you start to analyze information, you start to gain new insights and new ways of looking at the information, we're looking at more so a level 1 or a level 2. So it's probably a little bit more complex. You're probably working a little bit more autonomously, under the supervision of your manager. When we look at the final stages, and this is where we look, or where we expect students to be by the end of the 30 months as a newly certified CPA, you are now more effectively working on problem solving. You're looking more so at the so what of the analysis. You're probably providing recommendations, and you're working a lot more autonomously with more complex tasks and less routine items. Right. And so when we talk about the proficiency levels, so there's 3 proficiency levels. You have a level 0, a level 1, and a level 2. And this goes off of what we said in the previous slide. So a level 0, it's a lot more administrative or clerical. At a level 1, you're working on tasks that are a little bit more routine. A lower level of autonomy, you're starting to analyze information, probably not providing recommendations or conclusions on impact. And at a level 2, this is the experience that's expected of a newly certified CPA. So tasks are a little bit more complex. You're working a lot more autonomously. And when we talk about progressing through the duration of your practical experience, more often than not, within the first 12 months, we'd expect to see you starting to develop a lot of the level 1s. You might have 1 level 2 within the first 12 months. Closer to the 18 or 20 month mark, we'd maybe expect 2 level 2s, so that by the time that you reach the 30-month mark, you've achieved all 4 level 2s that are required for your DEF. So definitely something not to be concerned. If you do your 12-month profession assessment and you don't have any level 2s, that's fine. It's, are you progressing overall between a level 1 and a 2 throughout that 30 months? If by the time you're at the 18-month mark and you have 1 or 2, we definitely think that is reasonable. So if we go to the next slide. And so when we talk about the things that we need to consider for a level 2 response, so I've put up some different considerations here. So I'll probably start maybe from the bottom up. So the first one is, a lot of these sub-competency areas have multiple requirements. And one thing that we definitely note as reviewers when we're reviewing some of the responses is that students aren't addressing all of the requirements. So for example, financial report preparation, at a level 2, you're expected to be preparing the statements and the notes. So if you're only doing one or the other, it's not possible to be getting a level 2 in that area. Another thing to consider is the frequency of how often you're completing something. So for example, is the task that you're working on, have you only done it one time? Is it ad hoc? How often are you demonstrating those skills of that particular sub-competency area? When we look at autonomy, and I mentioned autonomy in the previous slides, it's how independently you're working on a task or you're carrying out a task. So are you working on it more independently? Are you drawing conclusions? Are you conducting that analysis? Or, are you working closely supervised under the direction of your manager? So how autonomously are you working, or independently are you working on a task, is also considered. We also look at, complexity of the task, which is associated with the degree of difficulty, and the nature of interrelationships and ambiguities that you would consider. So at a lower level of complexity, the analysis is a lot more straightforward. You're looking at more frequently encountered issues. It's a very basic approach. At a higher level of complexity, there's a large level of interrelationships and ambiguities that you're considering in the analysis, and then you're also looking at the different types of approaches that you're making for your recommendations, and what that impact is to your organization. As I mentioned before as well, you also talk about the duration. So within the first 6 months of your experience, we wouldn't expect that you would have all 4 level 2s and all of your core depth and breadth met. It's not reasonable, especially if you're just starting out into the workforce and you're just starting to develop those skills. And then we also talked about recommendations and impact. So, are you considering those interrelationships in your analysis? Are you considering the impact to your organization? And are you making any significant or strategic recommendations as a result? Okay. And so coming to the next slide, so we're going to talk to Fan. And the first question that we have for you, Fan, is for my technical competencies, how detailed does my response need to be?
Hi, everyone. Okay, yes, for technical competencies, what you should really focus on when you're answering these questions is letting the reviewer know how you're demonstrating these competencies. And as on a previous slide that Janelle had taken you through, you definitely want to talk about the task that you're doing, where you're demonstrating these competencies, and you want to talk about the frequency of those tasks. You want to talk about how complex some of those tasks are, and when you're talking about the analysis that you're preparing, talk about what factors, make it more complex. When we say complex, we're not talking about something that, a very experienced CPA would be working on. We're really talking about that maybe the solution isn't very clear because the factors you have to consider may be a little bit ambiguous, and the interrelationship between those variables may be unclear. So you really have to do some digging and research and figuring out, what are the main factors you have to consider. And as a result of that analysis, you'd be able to come to a good recommendation that makes a lot of sense and be able to make that recommendation. So if you focus on addressing each of those components, and more importantly is that you're not just doing something once. The examples should illustrate that you're consistently demonstrating at that level. So if it's just a one-time example, you may want to think about a second example that does give that impression that you are able to demonstrate that particular competency on a more consistent basis. And that's what we're looking for our level 2.
Mm-hmm. And then another thing to consider as well in terms of the detailedness of your response. So we don't need you to provide any confidential information about your company or about your financial reporting, but you also have to consider that us as reviewers, we don't know anything. So we only know, or we can only assess as much as what you document. So kind of taking into consideration a lot of those things that we discussed and that Fan mentioned, you want to be able to provide a good picture to say, here's how I'm assessing how my duties corroborate the sub-competency requirements. And if you kind of follow that format, then that's going to help your response a lot. And so Fan, the second question, and you kind of addressed some of these in your response just now, but what are some of the key differences between a level 1 and a level 2 response?
Yeah, so I did allude to that when I was answering the first question. So definitely the whole intention behind these proficiency level is to show that you're developing and you're getting better, because, when you learn a new skill, you really at the beginning don't really know much. You're really looking at examples of how something is being done. You're gathering information. You're trying to find out the what's. And then once you figure out what the what's are, like gathering all the input, then you would start to analyze it. And this is where you enter level 1, because at this point when you start working with the data and trying to figure out, what the data means, that's what we call analysis. And then once you do, and you're able to then say the so what, so now, I'm able to figure out these data means. So what? What does it all mean together? How does it impact my organization, or particularly my particular project I'm working on, or the particular task I'm doing? And so then you get to what we call the evaluate or recommendation type of level, which is the level 2. So you would go through this progression, and sometimes, these things could take a long time. Sometimes it could be very quick, but it's definitely a progression that you're going to be doing. So you're looking to build on some of these skills from information gathering to, looking at the analysis or figuring what all those different how they relate together, all the different factors, what it means, and then at the end, what the impact is, and the so what. And then that'll take you to the level 2. And you'll notice that not every single competency that's listed there, because there's 20 sub-competency altogether, not all of them need to be a level 2. So when Janelle was taking you through the core, depth, and depth area, sorry, core, breadth, and depth areas, she was telling you where the level 1s and level 2s are. So there's only 4 sub-competencies that you need to get to a level 2, and the other 4 is really just at a level 1 level, which is really just being able to analyze. And it's really taking it to that next step on 4 of those sub-competencies to get to the level 2, which is where we're looking for evaluation, recommendation, answering the so what, what's the impact.
And good to touch on that, Fan. So it's really important. So oftentimes we do see some instances where students will respond and they'll fill out all 20 sub-competency areas. And it's not practical, because it's kind of saying that you're a baker, you're a cook, you're a mechanic, you're all of these different things all at once. So it's really important to ensure that you're sitting with your mentor, you're sitting with your supervisor, and you're discussing those areas of what your core depth and breadth should be based on your role.
Yeah, for sure. The areas where you do get to the level 2 is mostly where you're spending a lot of your time on your job on those areas, because that's where you can really take it to that next level.
Most definitely. Thank you, Fan. So we'll come back to you quite shortly. Now going into the competency framework. So the first area that we're going to look at is financial reporting. So when we talk about financial reporting, we're talking about the requirement to report financial information to external stakeholders. So this could be a regulatory body, this could be a lender, the bank requiring statements because of a bank loan. The key thing to note here is that the end users are primarily external. The information in this area is often standards-based, so often in accordance with GAAP, IFRS, ASPE, NPO accounting, and there's an obligation to provide this information on a more consistent basis, so whether or not it's annually or quarterly, for example. It's important to note also that if your depth is in a standards-based area, such as financial reporting, your experience must include at least 6 months working within the Canadian standards. So definitely important to consider, whether or not your role is producing this information and the different tasks that you do to support this requirement. So getting into the question and answer. So Fan, the first question for you is, can a notice to reader engagement help me to qualify for a level 2 in financial reporting?
So generally the answer to that question would be a no. Notice to readers tend to be pretty non-complex, very straightforward. The notes areas tend to be pretty simplistic as well. They're definitely really, really great opportunities for a level 1, like to really get the gist of how financial statements work, how they come together, all the different components of it. So really great for, the level 1 exposure. But when it comes to the level 2, we're definitely looking for something more complex. So i.e. any statements that are reviews and more complex reviews, because there are review statements that could be pretty simple as well. And then definitely audited statements as well. And again, even within those areas, there are complex and non-complex ones. And the whole idea comes back to what we've been talking about, which is the idea of the progression. So we're definitely looking for, students to be able to get exposure on simple financial reporting, and then as they progress through their 30 months of required duration, they're moving into more complex areas of financial reporting, and that's how they would get to those level 2s.
Mm-hmm. And then to add on to that as well, so oftentimes we do realize that if you are working for a larger company, based on the role that you're in, you might not have exposure to the entirety of the financial statements, and that's okay. If you are working for a larger company, expectation is that you're likely preparing 1 or 2 sections and you're taking that through to presentation on the statements and the related note disclosures. But if you are working for a smaller company, where the financial statements might not be as complex, the expectation is that you would be preparing the majority of those statements and the notes at a level 2 exposure.
Yes. That's very true. Bigger organizations just have very complex financial statements that even very experienced CPAs would work on it, and there might be multiple experienced CPAs working on it. So in those cases, we're not expecting that CPA students would be, doing that type of work, but definitely there might be some non-complex areas that the students would begin to work on, and then as they get near their end of their duration to get to the level 2s, they would be working on some of the more complex areas of the statements. So that's another way that they can approach the level 2.
Most definitely. So then for the second question, so do I need to prepare both the financial statements and the notes to get a level 2 in financial report preparation?
So yes, for this particular competency, we are looking for experience with both preparing the financial statements themselves as well as the notes that goes with the statement. And that's because, again, this is at a level 2. So we're saying this is entry-level CPA. So if you're ready to be a CPA, the expectation is that you would be able to prepare any sets of financial statements and the notes related to it, because they are considered to be one comprehensive financial statement. So the notes are part of the financial statement. So it is very important that both sections, both components, be completed. And again, we're looking for complexity in terms of completing those, as well as independence, that you're able to do it on a more independent level. And please note that independent doesn't mean nobody reviews your work. So your supervisor would still be reviewing your work, except when your supervisors do review your work, they're not finding a whole bunch of different errors within the work that you do. 1 or 2 small minor review notes, definitely okay. But if there's more material errors, then we would consider that to be independent, i.e. you just need a little bit more practice and exposure in order to be able then to complete these financial statements and notes pretty well on your own without a lot of review notes coming back to you.
And I think one important thing to note here, because I do see this often, is that when we talk about note disclosures, we're talking about those external note disclosure requirements that are required under GAAP. So we're not talking about, financial statement level analysis where you're commenting on like the movement between certain FSLIs. We're talking about those disclosure requirements that are inherent and required under GAAP. So
correct. That goes together with the financial statement that gets disclosed.
Exactly. So then for the third question, if you indicate that you prepared the entirety of the financial statements and note disclosures, do you still have to give specific examples in your response?
Yeah, so here where it's helpful is that we do want to know how you're demonstrating that. So you can say, I do prepare the set of financial statements, including notes, but we don't know, is it what sort of, it could be for a subsidiary, like it could be for a holding company. So we just need a little bit more specific so we have some comfort that, you are truly doing that work. Because just saying I prepare the financial statements, it's very broad and generic, and we don't know how you've demonstrated that. And so if you're able to provide some specifics in terms of, I prepared, the entire consolidated statements, including the subsidiary for my organizations, that would be very helpful. Or I only did it for a sub, but it is a material sub. It makes up 95% of our company organization structure, something like that to give us some context in which the work that you're doing, and that would be extremely helpful. We wouldn't then have to come back to you and ask for more details.
Perfect. Thank you, Pam. So then now going to the next area, so talking about management accounting. So this is information that's prepared for internal users to help support various decision-making within the organization. And or you can look at a lot of the information the analysis prepared is to help assess operational efficiency and the effectiveness of the operations. And so, for example, whether or not it's to assess costs or revenue drivers or sources of sales or profitability, this information it's a lot of forward-looking information. It's helped to help decision making on how management will better run the business and the operations. I think key to know here is that the focus is not on the basis of accounting standards like financial reporting is, but rather on the needs of the internal users. So management, internal departments, etc. So we come into a common issue. So a common issue that we see when we're reviewing a lot of your guys' responses is the confusion between the difference between financial reporting or management accounting, and what essentially, where a student should be reporting their experience. So kind of help, to prepare a comparison chart to say, what are we looking at? And primarily to be focusing on, who's the audience. So for example, financial reporting, as we said before, a lot of the audience is external. So the stakeholders, the board, creditors, external auditors, versus management accounting, a lot of the audience is internal. So you're looking at the managers and the departments that help support decision-making within an organization. A lot of the purpose of the financial reporting information is for external stakeholders to disclose the financial results of the company. So for example, a bank would want your statements to, ensure that you're in compliance with their lending requirements, rather than management accounting. A lot of that information is to help support operational decision-making. So for example, pricing strategies, growth strategies, etc. And a lot of those audiences are internal to the company. When we look at the focus, a lot of the historical financial information is used within financial reporting. Not to say that you don't use historical financial information within management accounting. However, the purpose of it is different. So you use a lot of that information to help, for example, create budgets or to create forecasts and to promote forward-looking information to help set, goals on the organization's performance. Again, as we said before, financial reporting is very standards-based versus management accounting. The focus is on the user. So coming into another issue that we notice quite a bit is the difference between MA1, Management Reporting Needs and Systems, and FR1, Financial Reporting Needs and Systems. So if we go to the next slide. So looking at financial reporting needs and systems, so I'd mentioned before that a lot of the different sub-competency areas have multiple requirements. And MA1 and FR1 is a great example of those, in which you do need to address all the components of the area in order to get proficiency at any level. So when we look at the requirements to get a level or to get proficiency in financial reporting 1, the first part of both of these sub-competencies asks you to identify who the stakeholder is. So for example, who are the stakeholders, internal and external, and what are their financial reporting requirements? And the important here is the so what. They do have their financial reporting requirements, but how is it relevant to the decision making? And we do look for you to provide concrete examples to show that you're understanding that. Within FR1, you are required to answer one of the following two statements. So one is analyzing or assessing the appropriateness of the basis of financial reporting and how it's relevant to the company and to the stakeholders, or two, to analyze the accuracy and reliability of financial reporting information. So how do you help to evaluate or review the processes in order to support reliable financial reporting? I think another thing to note here is that a lot of times you will be able to address and identify, the needs of the stakeholders, but when we look at kind of the depth or proficiency in financial reporting, it's, are you working within the financial reporting environment? So if, for example, your role is more management accounting based, but, you can explain who the stakeholders are and why they need the financial reporting information, that's not to say that you might get proficiency in this area. It's, are you actively working on financial reporting, with the statements, with the analysis, and are you working on projects that would be relevant in this area? And we do have a couple examples that we can help to show you, and we'll show those after the slides. So when we look at MA1, again, this is another area that has multiple requirements. So the first one, again, is, what are management information requirements? The second one is, at a level 1, you would be expected to, provide examples of the types of information systems being used within the organization and how they're relevant to management decision making. The important difference here is that at a level 2, we're looking for what significant or material recommendations are you making to help enhance these reports or reporting systems? How are you helping to improve upon management information requirements for, a need that wasn't previously addressed? And then also important to, describe how that helps to better enable management decision making. There's also a third part to here, which a lot of students miss, is, how do you ensure data integrity or confidentiality within those reporting requirements or within those recommendations that you make? So getting into our first example is an example that we have here for financial reporting needs and systems. So our company was using ABC Financial Management System as our GL and financial reporting system. In Q4, senior management decided to separate our business into two major segments. This required us to make changes to our financial reporting system in order to meet the new requirement needs, consolidation, and the new requirement to present the business based on geographical location and business segment. I participated in the blueprint design and implementation of the new consolidation structure. I evaluated different options for generating business segment consolidation reports. Myself with the external consultants discussed and solved issues including elimination rules for investments, common shares, intercompany balances, and unrealized profits under the newly created business segment tree. This system improvement project was initiated to meet the filing requirements as our company is listed on the NASDAQ. It is required to provide segment reporting for major business lines, and with the improved consolidation system, both internal and external reporting requirements for segment reporting were met. And so this is a great example of a level 2 in which a student was involved in a system implementation and upgrade based on the changing needs of the business. And so they did a really good job here of laying out what happened within the business, why that change was needed, and also how they took part in performing the analysis in order to implement that change. And then, so coming to our example for management reporting needs and systems. So ClarityX is our internal reporting system that is used to store all financial information for all of our current projects. Key stakeholders include our business management team, finance team, and project management team. Management information requirements include accuracy, reliability, and consistency of financial records. So right here off the top in the first part of the response, the student has addressed, these are who our key stakeholders are, this is what our financial reporting system is, and this is why they need that information. So going into part 2, I analyze and monitor financial information for all of our current projects within the portfolio in order to ensure the information adheres to accuracy and reliability requirements. I have built a report based on data exports, which provides a high-level overview of project spend based on each category, for example, labor, software maintenance, license, and hardware costs. It presents multiple trend charts and ratio analysis of historical data versus forecasts. As a result, financial records can be easily accessed by the stakeholders and further used for decision-making processes. So again, in part 2, the student has showed, how they created a reporting requirement that there was a need for that wasn't previously there before. And this is improving management decision-making. And then under part 3, our financial information contains confidential data. I provide ongoing training to project managers and advise them on the role ClarityX plays in the organization and inform them about the confidential records which need to be safeguarded. In addition, any reports that I create I ensure are distributed to the right audience so that only intended users can have access to them. So again, this is ensuring, the student is showing, here's how I ensure data integrity and confidentiality of the recommendations and the reports that they created. So the student has, I would say, successfully answered all 3 parts to the sub-competency area requirement. All right. So going into the next the next competency requirement, we have finance. So when we think of finance, we think of, assessing the risks that could impact the overall health of the organization. So for example, going concern, liquidity. You could also be, developing financing plans or evaluating different sources of financing. A lot of times for a lot of the financial analyst roles, a huge part of the responsibilities include, the managing of cash flows and working capital, and what to do with, the excess cash or distribution. You could also report, your experience under valuation and financial modeling, or capital budgeting, or you could be looking at financial risk management. So for example, evaluating financial risk management policies and monitoring exposure in order to help manage the different risks within the organization, or analyzing financial models and evaluating the feasibility of capital projects. So one of the issues that we do note as reviewers, so kind of taking into account all 3 of those sections, so management, accounting, financial reporting, and finance, is that students are often confused where their analysis fits within each of those 3 areas. So at a high level, if we're looking at financial reporting, a lot of these areas analyze historical financial information, but the difference is the focus of what that information is for. So as we were saying before, management accounting, whether or not that's the analysis that you do under MA2, which is planning, budgeting, and forecasting, so your budget to actual analysis, or under MA3, under cost, profitability, and revenue management, the impact of this analysis is forward-looking. You're assessing the impact on management decision-making. So for example, this could be, the impact towards pricing decisions, or, what this does for your production strategies, or what this does for your costing decisions. And some of the examples that you could see are similar between all three of those areas, such as FS analysis, ratio analysis, or break-even analysis. When we look at finance, oftentimes we're looking at the bigger picture of the company. So you're assessing the impact on the company's financial state or condition. And a lot of times when we're thinking about interpreting that, a lot of times students get, confused with, what do you mean by assessing the entity's financial state? So if you think within the realm of, assessing liquidity or solvency or profitability or operating efficiency, in a whole within the bigger picture of the company, then you're more likely your analysis is more likely appropriate under finance. When we look at financial reporting, as we discussed before, so it's ultimately to disclose the period end results to stakeholders. So a lot of it is looking at historical information, or the impact on transactions during the period, and what this says in comparison to prior periods. And so a lot of times you'll see this analysis might go into an DNA, or it might get sent to the board, in the sense of ratio analysis or variance analysis, or you could be, potentially looking at period over period trending. All right. So we have another example for you guys here. So if we're looking at an example under financial analysis and planning for FN1, so our evaluation of client companies' financial states include a combination of ratio analysis, i.e. profitability, coverage, leverage, etc., trend analysis, so for example, the compound annual growth rate, different drivers, etc., and cash flow analysis. So for example, cash flow from operations, funds from operations, maintenance, acquisitions, dividends, etc. So based on the understanding of the company's financial state, we would recommend the applicable financing options along with the pros and cons associated with the different options. Now for this response, I would give this a level 1, and this is to kind of help you guys differentiate that. At a level 2, the student is saying that we would recommend different financing options. It would be good to show, what financing options are you recommending? What's the analysis that you're looking at in terms of assessing which one's appropriate, and discussing some of those pros and cons. But definitely the student is on their way towards a good response here. Okay. So coming into audit and assurance. So when we look at audit and assurance, oftentimes to get proficiency in this area, you do need to be working within an internal or external audit role. And so when we look at some of the areas that are covered within an internal or external audit role, could be looking at the risk assessment of the control environment and the impact of financial reporting and or information systems. So this is AA1. This doesn't necessarily require you to be in an internal or external audit role, but it does require you to look at the bigger process. So a lot of times, I would say the most popular answer that we get is, segregation of duties. For example, payment processing. I processed a check and I had my supervisor sign it. So that's just looking at a particular task. That's not actually looking at the bigger picture of the risk assessment around, for example, the purchases and payables process, and what the different risks in that process say towards financial reporting, and the different recommendations that you're making to address those risks. So it's really important for Audit and Assurance 1, that you are performing the risk assessment of either the control environment and or information systems, and making sure you're hitting each of the requirements under that sub-competency in terms of looking at the bigger picture of the process. When we get to AA2 and AA3, those are where you're actually performing audit engagements. So either as an internal auditor or an external auditor. And this requires you to, for example, determine the audit requirements. You could be preparing an audit plan. You could be performing a risk assessment and indicating how that risk assessment impacts your audit plan. You could be setting materiality. And then AA3 is looking at, how are you executing the audit plan in terms of performing procedures, analyzing evidence, or concluding on the results. Also important to note is that, again, as I was saying earlier, if you are achieving a depth in a standards-based area, such as audit and assurance, you must be working within the Canadian standards for at least 6 months, and this applies to this area as well. All right, so getting into our question and answer. So Fan, our first question for you: for someone working in industry, how can we accumulate experience in audit and assurance?
Okay, yes, very good question. So in industry, mostly what we see where students would be able to get exposure in this area would be if they were working in their internal audit area. So they would be looking at either controls, processes, even sometimes financial engagements or different projects within their organization in their audit department. So most organizations might have an internal audit department, and then they would be focusing on making sure processes, controls, and even financials are in order. And sometimes they do this in addition to having an external auditor come in and look at their financials and processes as well. So that would be a really good, clear way for students to be able to develop these competencies if they work in that particular department. What we also see students able to gain some experience in this area is under what we call the Audit and Assurance 1 or AA1 competency or sub-competency. So that's looking at internal controls. So if you were asked to do a project where you would document and review the internal controls within your organization, and then if you take it all the way to being able to make recommendations in order to address the weaknesses in controls and make recommendations to some strong controls that would strengthen the internal control process, we do see that students would be able to get some level 1s or level 2s in that area as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Fran. Okay, so for the second question, can internal auditing hours count towards the practical experience requirement?
So something I wanted to make clear for everybody is that when you're going through practical experience and you're gaining experience towards your CPA designation, really what we're looking for are two components there. One is duration, so you need to do at least 30 months of time, and the second one is competencies. So you have to develop the minimum competencies. So we talked about it in terms of technical competencies and in terms of enabling competencies. And within the technical competencies, that's where Janelle was talking about the core, depth, and breadth requirements. So that we put it all as something called competencies. So if you're able to meet the competencies and you did it within at least 30 months or more, then you've met the exit requirements for practical experience in terms of getting membership, okay? But if in addition to that, you also want to be eligible for a license to practice public accounting, so for that, there is an additional requirement, which is the chargeable hour requirement. And if that's what you're interested in, you actually have to have certain criteria that you have to meet, one of which is you do have to work in a pre-approved external audit program, and you are likely going to be doing chargeable hour work. And so that's where you have to report chargeable hours to us. In the other two, like in any cases outside of that, so you're not meeting the licensure requirements, we're not asking for chargeable hours. We're just asking for duration, so that's time spent, and we're asking for competencies. And so if you also want eligibility for licensure, then you have to get duration, competencies, as well as the required chargeable hours. So hopefully that'll answer that. If you're doing internal audit, then you're not going to be, you're working outside of a licensure pathway, in which case you're really only reporting on duration and competencies.
Exactly. So internal auditing time can count. It just wouldn't count for your licensure purposes, essentially.
Exactly.
So then kind of a great filter into question number 3. So if I'm reporting through the experience verification route, and I think the student meant to clarify, you know, and they're working within the firm environment, do I need to provide chargeable hours?
So yeah, so in that context, the reason why we're asking for chargeable hours is really to support the level 2 that is being claimed. And here we just need to understand how much time or exposure the particular student has worked in that particular engagement or type of engagement. And so we're asking for the purposes really just helping us to determine if there's sufficient exposure to develop to the level 2 proficiency level, and we're not asking for the purposes of meeting the licensure chargeable hour requirement. So there's a difference in this sense. So here it's just to support the level 2 competencies that are being claimed, and those hours will not count towards the licensure requirement because it's not in the right environment. It has to be in a pre-approved external audit program before those chargeable hours can be counted towards licensure requirements.
Thank you, Fan.
You're welcome.
So going into taxation, so when we're looking at experience in taxation, this can be gained in 3 areas. So this could be work that's being done around income tax legislation and research. It could also be work that's done around tax compliance, which is more common. So for example, assessing tax compliance issues and either preparing corporate or personal tax returns. Or it could be around tax planning at the individual or the organization level. Also as well, because this is an area of depth, if you are working, if this is an area of depth for you, candidates, you would have to be working within the Canadian Income Tax Act for at least 6 months. So we'll come to some of the questions that we had in this area. And the first question for you, Fan, is how can I report my work experience on commodity tax or indirect tax, and what should I consider?
Yes, you can report your experience that you have in commodity tax or indirect tax, but it's very, very important for you to detail out to us what sort of tasks you were doing in relation to these areas, i.e., is it more information gathering? If it's more than that, i.e., getting into analyzing commodity tax, then tell us how you're doing that. And then if you are doing more than analyzing, you are going to make recommendations, answering the so what of those analyses, which is getting you to those level 2 proficiencies. Then again, how are you doing that, and give us some examples to support that. Because a lot of times when it comes to commodity tax or indirect tax work, it is more about just really gathering the information together and then putting that into the report for reporting to CRA. And so we're not seeing that it would really come to the part where analysis are being done and recommendations are being made. And so, so to be able to claim a level 1 and support it, or a level 2, we really do need the details to indicate why it would be at a level 1 demonstration or a level 2 proficiency demonstration. There are certain industry where this area is very complex, and as a result of that, it definitely meets the definitions for level 1 and level 2, and therefore we could award that to students in these areas. But many times, based on what we've seen, is it's more centered around information gathering, and so because of that, then they wouldn't be able to have those opportunities to get to that level 1 or the level 2.
Perfect. And so our second question is, in general for tax, what things should I consider for a level 2 in this area? And I guess this is considering the firm environment and the corporate environment.
So in the firm environment, we're definitely seeing that. I am assuming this question is referring to getting a depth in the area of tax, because if that's the case, we're definitely seeing that it's pretty, there's lots of opportunities for students to really be able to develop a level 2 in tax 1. So that's where you're doing research about different tax legislations and really, doing that analysis on the research, coming to recommendations in terms of the research related to different tax topics and different tax areas. So we definitely see that many times students don't have any trouble in that area, both in the firm environment because they might be doing research for their clients, or in a corporate environment where they're now doing research related to tax matters that relate to the organization that they work for. Okay, so that those two seem to be similar in terms of the work they do. Just the focus is many clients versus just one client, which is the organization you're in. Again, we're looking at the complexity of those research that you're doing to support the level 2. In tax 2, which is compliance, so here's where you're working on preparing a tax return. So in a firm environment, lots of opportunities for students again, because you're preparing, tax returns for the clients, and especially with tax season being April for personal and June for corporate, there's lots of exposure for students to be able to get into developing level 1s and level 2s in the tax 2 area. In the corporate environment, you're probably preparing tax returns for the employer, the organization you're working for. And again, depends on how complex or big your organization is. You may have tax returns you have to do for multiple companies. Could be the main operating company or the head office, and then there might be subsidiaries that need to be, like tax return must be prepared for them. There might be trust returns and other types of returns that need to be done. And so in a larger organization, you'll have many types of different tax returns that you're getting different exposure to versus a firm where it's just different clients that you're preparing tax returns for. And then tax 3 is the planning. So this is where students typically don't get as much exposure because a lot of their time's already spending on research and preparing the tax returns. So it's really, once they get a lot of experience in that area, then they can get into the more tax planning. So they might get some exposure into more non-complex tax planning issues, but the more complex one maybe, after they're already an entry-level CPA. So that's when they've already got all the background and foundation that they can build on to get into more of those complex areas. And again, the difference is in a firm environment, you're doing tax planning for multiple clients that have engaged your firm to provide that service, versus in a corporate, you're only doing it for your organization that you're working for. And again, depending on the size of your organization, it may be pretty straightforward because you just have one company versus multiple entities that your organization is a part of, and therefore it encompasses a more complex structure, more complex areas of taxes that your company might be involved in.
Perfect. Thank you, Fran. Now going into the last section, so strategy and governance. And so do you find that, oftentimes, unless a student is in a risk management role, it's really hard to we don't see a lot of students getting kind of a breadth or a depth in this area. And so looking at some of the areas that you can report under, when we think strategy and governance, we're looking at what tasks are, impacting corporate governance. So for example, internal and external regulations, policies and code, or the formulation of strategies and kind of translating those strategies into specific business objectives and action plans. This could also include, the implementation of those different strategic plans. So you could be analyzing or assessing the entity's risk management processes under strategies, or providing recommendations to the strategic plan. And this is, definitely considering different internal factors within the organization or external factors as well. A lot of times, if students are getting proficiency in this area, they're doing a lot of work around ensuring that the entity remains compliant with the different regulatory requirements. So to come into kind of the last batch of question and answers that we had, the first question that we have, and Fanny can probably answer this one, is what are the different requirements to record prior experience in PERT? And so when looking at recording prior experience, this is any work experience gained prior to the PERT effective date. And so normally your PERT effective date is going to be set in PERT once your role has been approved, once you have a mentor on your profile, and then your PERT effective date will be set. You don't necessarily have a specific deadline to report this. However, you can record up to 12 months of prior experience as long as it happened within the last 5.5 years preceding your PERT effective date. There is you do create this as a normal experience report, and it would either be prior EB or prior PPR, and then you would submit your profession assessment to get this captured. So the second question, Fan, for you, do I need to continue reporting a sub-competency once I've achieved a level 2 in that area?
Okay, so no, you don't have to. What would make it really, really clear for your reviewer would be you can just write like a single sentence that just says you continue to be performing those tasks at the same level that you've previously reported, or continue to perform tasks as previously reported. That way, your reviewer can get the sense that your tasks haven't changed. You continue working on those, and then you really just only have to focus on any new tasks that you're doing, or the same task you're doing, but at a different different proficiency level is what you want to focus your reporting on subsequently.
Awesome. Okay, so then the third question is, how long will it take me to achieve a depth in a sub-competency area?
So that really depends, because as you guys all know, everybody learns at different levels, right? So some people might be really fast at picking something up, and therefore they can really demonstrate it at that proficiency level very quickly. Other people might take them a lot longer. It also depends on how much exposure you have, because maybe that particular task only comes around 2 times a year. So therefore, in order for you to get more than one exposure to it, you really have to wait, a whole year before you can say, I've demonstrated that particular competency. So we do have to look at, how often that task occurs and how complex is that particular task. Because if it's easy, again, quite simple to pick it up. If it's something that's harder, multiple steps involved, and maybe even knowledge, like you might have to have certain technical knowledge as background in order to be able to then bring it to that next level. So, so all those things need to be taken into consideration. We always say that it seems to make sense that it be easier or faster to move from a level 0 to a level 1, but then it usually takes a little longer to turn a level 1 into a level 2, because now you really have to bring it to a higher level where it's a little bit more complex, that you have to really take everything that you've already have gathered and analyzed, and then really, have to turn it around and say, so what does this mean, right? And so that usually takes a higher level of skill to do that. And so we do think that takes a little bit longer time. In general, depending on if you've got a lot of exposure and consistent exposure to that particular area, we usually say that it takes about 12 months to develop, 2 level 2s. And so that's a general rule of thumb, but we still have to think about all the other factors that surrounds it as well. But that would be the general rule of thumb.
Mm-hmm. And then just to kind of add on to that quickly, so a lot of the times you do say it takes time to develop a level 2 because of a lot of the things that we mentioned before with frequency, and kind of like what Fan was saying before, it does take time to move to level 2 to work at that higher level. But for example, for some areas, like financial report preparation and budget preparation, we do look at you to do that more than once. So, preparing one budget, is probably definitely at a level 1. But, to show us that, you've worked on multiple budgeting cycles, each subsequently at, a higher level of complexity, you're working on a little bit more complex areas, that's going to help better support your level 2. And that definitely does take time. So going to question number 4, for the PPR route, how do technical competencies get assessed, duration or audit hours? And I know, Fanny, you touched on this before, so maybe just a brief summary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so briefly, just for PPR route, and especially those in external audit, we are definitely looking at both duration and audit hours, so chargeable hours. So both of them will be taken into consideration. Any other time, we are definitely looking at duration as something we look at, but in addition to that, we're also looking at complexity and independence, right? So those are all factors that we take into consideration.
Perfect. And the last question, how do proficiency levels work for technical competencies when you switch jobs? If you've already obtained a level 2, do you need to continue reporting in this area?
So yes, if you continue to have performed similar tasks, even though you've already attained a level 2, again, what I said earlier, just like a brief statement to indicate that. Sometimes when you switch jobs, you might take on a job in a completely different competency area, i.e. you might be doing audit and then you move to tax. So then, no, we don't expect that you would be continuing to report any audit tasks that you might be doing, because you probably won't be doing any of those. So you would then be focusing on your tax competencies. But keep in mind, again, what we talked about earlier, if you're developing competencies, especially from 0 to 1 to 2, you have to keep in mind that that takes time, right? So you may not be able to reasonably expect that it'll take you, the 30 months and you have 2 completely different jobs developing competencies in very different areas. Like if you can't build upon what you've already started working on in the job prior to the new job, then it would likely mean that you need a little bit more extra time. And there's definitely nothing wrong with that. I mean, it was just a different way to get to the end point, but it doesn't mean you won't get to the end point.
Perfect. Thank you, Fan. Okay, so I think that concludes all of our that concludes our presentation for today and all of our questions. So thank you guys all for attending. We will, make the slides available one day after the webinar closes. And so just on the next few slides, you have some different resources and some links that will be helpful for you. Thank you guys all for attending.